Mm-hmm. Good morning, everyone. Bonjour. I'm Dijanakas Wapip Kinyu, Mekanakto Dem. My name is Rai Moran, and I will be your host for this morning's important ceremony honoring and acknowledging residential school survivors. I'd like to say a particular warm welcome to all of you that are joining us from coast to coast to coast as we honor, acknowledge, remember, and keep our eyes cast towards the future. We would like to begin with an opening prayer, and we've invited a member of our Survivor Circle and somebody very dear to us, Grandfather Wambadi, to open this event up in a good way. Wambadi.
I make prayer with this tobacco. When we had ceremony a few days back, we were told that this COVID will be a little bit longer. It will be a little bit longer because we need to go back to the original road. We make prayers for family. We make prayers for good health, life, strength, and endurance. We ask Creator to show us what love and peace means. We promise Creator, whatever Creator teaches us, whatever Creator gives us, whatever Creator shows us, whatever Creator tells us, that we would put action to these things for our own self. And we would share that because we know that that's what brings goodness. I will say this prayer in my Dakota language. Ao tukanshira, ateo kantaka. Ampetu steo yaku piro. Awo kiksue ostesti hanawazi heche. Kamitako eke. Hechi wakan hechi wichaya duha. Awan wichada ke hecha wichanda piro. Oecha ampetu kindehu kuya hinto ba. Oyati kindena unshi wichada wo. Kai chin stako te heko wichaki pazotka. Anu yuha. Wa akhbar wa shira yuha oya kumpta oya teke etawo speech upta ka wichone wichoza nikta ka wo ashaki wo honi ka wo speo kakhne geta hichupti yechache o ena khecha na mita ko eke tiwa hatiosh pai o ta ko eke na eri uchato iktedo wo pe osteste, wo pe wakan, ostestu yaki pazu pe ampetu yoya. Hana wo pire ichichi apiro tu kanshira te akantaka. Tu kata ke chankudu tu zia kani pira chamauni pta. Kahna tako astekti kachihna struya piro. Pidao ya piro tu kanshira ate akantaka. Tate makochi echia. Echia ta ahito na kapicha. Pidao ya pido. Unshunda po. Ikchewi chasta. Wa mani chawa khupa koso ate pijota ate kingden makagdera kan. Awan wicha kawo hanach wichokhon te khika. Uyo hapit ka. Awan yeda kapi hecha wich studoya pe wichauda pido. Unshunda po. Unshunda po. Hona ukhupo. Oh no, Omitake-os, all my relations. Thank you. Thank you.
Merci, Miigwech, Grandfather Wambadi. Today's program, we're going to be hearing from people speaking to us from across the country as we gather virtually to honor and acknowledge this difficult history that we're coming together and confronting. Before we hear from any of these speakers, we would like to share with you an important video that has been created by a very talented local filmmaker here that will help us collectively understand what this history is that we're confronting and the long road ahead that we still have to walk this path of healing.
This video deals with topics that may cause trauma invoked by memories of past abuse. The Government of Canada recognizes the need for safety measures to minimize the risk associated with triggering. A National Indian Residential School Crisis Line has been set up to provide support for former residential school students. You can access emotional and crisis referral services. You can also get information on how to get other health supports from the Government of Canada. Please call the crisis line at 1-866-925-4419 if you or someone you know is triggered while viewing this video. For more than a century, Canada's system of residential schools separated over 150,000 First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children from their families. Residential schools were a calculated system focused on individual and cultural assimilation, or to kill the Indian in the child. The Truth and Reconciliation Commissions described the residential school system as a form of cultural genocide. Today, we recognize that this policy of assimilation was wrong and reflects a dark and shameful time in Canada's history. We also recognize that the residential school system has had a lasting and profoundly damaging impact on Indigenous people, communities, culture, and language across Canada. By acknowledging the past and educating Canadians about the experiences of Indigenous children in these schools, we will ensure that the history is never forgotten and never again will these tragedies be repeated.
I'm Janet Longclaws. I live in Long Plain First Nation. I'm a residential school survivor. I went to Brandon Indian Residential School for 5 years.
Residential boarding schools are older than Canada itself. The first school opened in the early 1830s. Concerted federal government involvement in the residential schools began in the 1880s, and the last residential school closed as recently as the late 1990s.
My father was a truck driver. He would leave before we left. He didn't want to be there when we left. And Mom was home alone. She tried to be joyful and cheerful, and she would hug us all the time.
Successive generations of families went to residential schools. The government allowed children to suffer discrimination and abuse, including malnutrition. At some schools, children were subjected to nutritional experiments.
My name is Wambadi Wakita. I come from the community called Sioux Valley. I am Dakota. I went to 2 different schools. One was called Bertle Indian Residential School. And my dad said, if you kids don't go to school, the RCMP is going to put me in jail, he said. My experience was I grew up really protected at home when I was young. My mom and dad, my grandpa, my brothers and sisters. But when I went to residential school, that's totally a different way of doing things. Eating, for instance, they practically starved you.
Many of the people and institutions who were entrusted with the care and protection of the children instead subjected them to discrimination, hardship, neglect, and emotional, physical, and sexual abuse, leaving a multi-generational legacy of pain and trauma.
In residential school, we only lived in moments. Moments where we could just stand still, be a little soldier, not look, not see, not hear, not witness anything.
Residential schools focused on assimilation, cutting the long hair of children and cutting their ties to their culture. Children were punished severely and sometimes even beaten for speaking in their language or following their traditions.
The teacher was absolutely mean. She threw chalk and brushes at us. She twisted my ear. I never seen that teacher smile once. She was always had that mean look.
Indigenous children were isolated from their homes and their communities, from the nurturing support of their parents, from their language, from their traditions, and from their cultures.
We also had to go to church. I don't know what kind of church that was, but when you went to residential school and you had to sing these strange songs and say these prayers in an English language, you know, that's quite a deal actually, to try and be somebody else and you're not. You know, we lost a lot of things. Culture. Well, language is culture. And all our songs, our ceremonies, all of those things were missed by those people who went to residential school. And you could tell that it was hurtful. Not only did they lose their culture, they also was punished by severe abuse, horrific abuse. I mean, how is it possible that we would go through something like that? And you know, a lot of us done our best to survive from those kinds of things.
Thousands of Indigenous children died while attending residential schools. Some of these buildings still stand. The unmarked graves that scatter the country lie silent.
Our community has the Portage Indian residential schools at our Kishkimakwa Reserve near Portage Prairie. We've been working on keeping that building, restoring it as a heritage place, and it's important that we have that. Some people won't go into the building. For some of our elders, they won't go near the place, and I understand that. It's a reminder that we're still here. It's a legacy, perhaps not ours, but we can be part of it, and it's okay. Yeah.
Today, residential school survivors still carry the scars of abuse. Many of those scars have been passed down to the generations who have followed. But the survivors are also strong. They have fought hard to bring their experiences to light and continue to demand justice and accountability. This has paved the way for the reclamation of cultural traditions, relearning of languages, and healing.
Our Indian residential school experiences matter because we matter. And we need to carry on with courage and honor our culture, our languages, our families, our communities. And we can be resilient. We are still resilient. We're still here, and we will continue to be.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's Call to Action number 79 challenges us all to ensure the injustices of the past will never be repeated, and that the remaining effects of these injustices will be overcome through mutual respect and partnership. This call asks Canada to recognize residential schools as a central aspect of its history as a country, to never forget the harms, the history, and legacy of residential schools, and the children who paid the ultimate price. Together, we are taking a significant step forward to ensure all children know and understand the full scope of their shared history. We can never forget what the survivors endured. Through remembering these harms of the past, We are creating a world where the children of today and tomorrow are given the information they need to build a Canada free from inequality and injustice. The courage, determination, and strength of residential school survivors has given us the collective opportunity to build a better Canada.
I would like to extend my sincere thanks to the very talented Erica Daniels who produced that film for us all to reflect upon as we move into the announcement portion of this day's event. I have the pleasure to introduce Jonathan Wilkinson, the Minister of Environment and Climate Change and the Minister responsible for Parks Canada, who will be making this historic announcement today. His announcement will be followed by remarks from the Honourable Carolyn Bennett, Minister of Crown, Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs Canada, and from Mark Miller, Minister of Indigenous Services Canada.
Hello everyone, bonjour tout le monde. First, I would like to acknowledge that I am speaking from the traditional and ancestral territories of the Coast Salish people, including the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. It is an honor and a privilege to be part of today's announcement. I would like to thank everyone participating for taking the time to recognize this very important commemoration. Je tiens à remercier tous les participants d'avoir pris le temps de reconnaître cette importante commémoration. In order for us to renew our relationship with Indigenous communities, with a relationship built on reconciliation, respect, partnership, we must first acknowledge and understand our shared past. This includes facing the difficult periods and actions that exist within Canada's history, including the wrongs perpetrated against Indigenous peoples and the ongoing intergenerational trauma that has followed. Aujourd'hui, le gouvernement du Canada reconnaît l'importance nationale du système des pensionnats autochtones comme l'un des événements les plus tragiques de notre histoire. Une période honteuse qui continue de causer de la douleur et de la souffrance aujourd'hui. Le système des pensionnats a eu des répercussions négatives sur la vie d'innombrables peuples autochtones ainsi que sur les relations entre les peuples autochtones et non-autochtones. Today, the Government of Canada is recognizing the national significance of the residential school system as one of the most tragic events in our history, a period that continues to cause pain and suffering today. The residential school system negatively affected the lives of countless Indigenous people, as well as the relationship between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples. From this day forward, the residential school system will be designated as an event of national historic significance, which will help to educate all Canadians on the system and its consequences, and ensure this part of our history is never forgotten or repeated. We know that the residential school system in Canada has had a profoundly lasting and damaging impact on Indigenous peoples, communities, cultures, economies, traditional knowledge and ways of life, their languages, family structures, connections to the land, and more. Today's announcement also includes the designation of 2 former school sites that were part of the residential school system for their national historic significance. The former Chouvenacadie Residential School in Nova Scotia and the former Portage-la-Prairie Residential School in Manitoba. These designations are an important part of the Government of Canada's response to Call to Action 79 from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which calls for the national commemoration of residential school sites, their history, and legacy. La commémoration consiste à marquer et à se souvenir de nombreux aspects divers de l'histoire du Canada, y compris les périodes de notre histoire qui peuvent être inconfortables pour nous. Commemoration is about the marking and remembrance of many diverse aspects of Canada's history, including the periods of history that may be uncomfortable for us to face. I wish to thank the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation and the Survivors Circle for their tireless work and for co-developing the submission that led to this designation. I also want to acknowledge all the residential school survivors who fought so long to have their stories heard and who suffered through the retelling of those stories so that we could all learn from them. To all those who suffered discrimination, mistreatment, abuse, and neglect in residential schools, we are sorry. While these designations will not undo the harm that was done, it is my hope that we can learn from the past and continue to advance our journey of truth-telling, reconciliation, and healing. For a better future for all, we must accept and learn from the past. The Government of Canada is committed to walking a path that leads to a stronger relationship with Indigenous peoples, built on reconciliation, respect, and partnership. Nous nous engageons également à mettre pleinement en œuvre chaque appel à l'action du rapport de la Commission de vérité et réconciliation. Cette désignation n'est qu'une partie du travail que nous devons accomplir. Nous poursuivons ensemble sur cette voie. We are also committed to fully implementing every call to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report. This designation is just one piece of the work we will have to do. We will continue down this road together. Again, I thank the survivors, their families, and communities that continue to courageously bring public attention to the legacy of residential schools so that we may never forget the injustices that occurred and ensure that such things never occur again. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Greetings, bonjour, ok, Annie. Je me joins à vous sur le territoire traditionnel de Mississaugas de Credit, où on honore tous les peuples autochtones qui ont pagaillé sur ces eaux et dont les mocassins ont parcouru ces terres. Le système des pensionnats indiens est une tragédie née des politiques coloniales qui ont porté préjudice aux enfants, à leurs familles et à leur communauté. The Indian residential school system is a tragedy born of colonial policies that harmed children, their families, and their communities. This is not ancient history. I had no idea when I was elected to Parliament in 1997 that the last residential school had closed a year before, in 1996. The survivors are many. The victims, tragically, are many more as we recognize the intergenerational trauma still impacting generations of children and grandchildren of those that attended the residential schools. Designating the legacy of the Indian residential schools as a historic event of national significance and the acknowledgement of the Shubenacadie and the Portage La Prairie Indian residential schools as two of the many potential National Historic Sites will now support the healing journeys for those survivors and communities harmed. It will also ensure that Canadians know their history, that all Canadians learn from it. Once we know the truth, we cannot unknow it. These designations come at a time where people are standing up against systemic racism, injustice, and violence. This is a time for everyone to pause and reflect on the harm that generations of Indigenous people have endured. This is a time for all Canadians to read the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This is a time for all of us to determine what role we will play in promoting a better understanding of the past so that we can make the changes necessary to build a better future together. We will continue to work to advance reconciliation and towards a nation-to-nation, Inuit Crown, and government-to-government relationship with Indigenous peoples, based on affirmation of rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership. Nous continuerons de travailler pour faire avancer la réconciliation et l'établissement de relations de nation à nation entre les Inuits et la Couronne et de gouvernement à gouvernement avec les peuples autochtones, fondés sur la reconnaissance des droits, le respect, la coopération et le partenariat. Thank you. Merci. Miigwech, Kriyanamik, Marci, Marcicho.
Greetings, bonjour, oki, ani. I am speaking to you today from the traditional territory of the Algonquin people. The residential school system is a national tragedy, born of colonialism and propelled by systemic racism. Acknowledging this past and educating Canadians about the experiences of Indigenous children in these schools will ensure that this history is never forgotten. The first residential schools were opened toward the end of the 19th century, and the last ceased operation only near the close of the 20th century. This is not ancient history. The number of survivors is great, the victims even greater. The healing process is long. Cette journée fait partie de ce processus. Cette journée est consacrée à la guérison. This is an important part of Canada's response to Call to Action 79 of the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which called for the national commemoration of residential school sites and the history and legacy of residential schools. Il est essentiel que tous les Canadiens connaissent leur histoire. Nous devons veiller à ce que cette oppression et cette négligence ne se répètent jamais. Ainsi, il ne faut jamais oublier le mal, la cruauté et l'héritage honteux des pensionnats. Bannissons à jamais l'idéologie raciste qui a permis la création de ces pensionnats. Rendons hommage à ces nombreuses victimes en travaillant ensemble à renouveler un partenariat fondé sur le respect, le dialogue et la reconnaissance des droits. Today is a day for mourning, a day for commemoration, a day for Canadians to hope for a better future as we acknowledge a shameful past. Le gouvernement du Canada est déterminé à bâtir un pays diversifié et inclusif. Le gouvernement est déterminé à se réconcilier avec les peuples autochtones du Canada. We know that we cannot take those important steps forward without addressing the wrongs of our past. Thank you. Miigwech, merci, Nanamik, Masicho.
As the director of the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, it's my honor to provide some reflections upon this important step that we've taken in our national efforts to remember, honor, acknowledge what residential school survivors endured in those schools for so many years. Reflective of the significance of this event, this morning we asked a national group of elders to say their prayers and lift their pipes for healing, strength, and resilience. I'd like to specifically thank these elders and the Turtle Lodge for this ceremony. These prayers, of course, involve all of us, this hope for a better nation, this hope for a just and fair and equitable Canada that we have, of course, yet to see. There have been so many ceremonies done over the years, and even just recently there were important ceremonies held in Long Plains and in Shubenacadie commemorating this important day. As we worked with survivors across the country to submit and prepare our submission to the National Historic Sites and Monuments Board, there were a number of key themes that emerged that I wish to share with you. The first of these themes was that the residential school policy created grave and lasting harms for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children, their families, and their communities. We've heard far too many stories of languages being silenced, young children being beat, ripped away from their loved ones and their communities at home. These harms will take generations to overcome, but through our collective work and our acknowledgement of these harms, the healing can continue. Secondly, the residential schools was a central pillar in a long-standing and deliberate assault on Indigenous peoples, their cultures, and their identities. We call this cultural genocide, and that's what it is, because of how all-encompassing, how deliberate, how intentional these efforts to silence Indigenous peoples were for decades. Thirdly, it is crucial that we continue to honor and never forget all those children that never returned home from the schools. There are sadly thousands of children still yet to be found out there, and hundreds of grave sites still to be identified. We can never forget these children, and each and every day we must commit ourselves to honoring and remembering them. But a fourth and very essential part of this designation is recognizing and honoring the heroic efforts of residential school survivors to tell their stories and bring these truths to light. This has been a decades-long effort to break the silence. Residential school survivors have been a crucial catalyst for Canada to overcome its stained human rights record towards First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. The accounts of residential school survivors and their bravery in coming forward to tell their stories will reverberate in the national consciousness for years, generations, and decades to come. Finally, why Call to Action 79 is so critically important is that it is part of an overall framework of calls that recognize that Canada itself has an obligation to remember. Canada itself has a duty to preserve and protect its own record of human rights violations. The protection of these records, the protection of this knowledge, is an important safeguard against recurrence. And importantly, given the significant discussions in Canada about whom and what we remember, this is a critically important step in balancing our collective historical narrative. Historical accuracy, truth-telling, requires the establishment of new memorials just as much as it requires us to question those that we have celebrated in our past. One day, I see a country where there will be highway signs marking some of these places. I see a Canada where the majority of Canadians will not be able to drive by and remain ignorant of the existence of these sites of long-standing human rights violations right within their own backyards. As these places become more known, we will be challenged to confront and face our history in ways that we haven't been challenged before. And in so doing, we will be equipping ourselves with the knowledge and insight necessary to fully and meaningfully pursue a path of human rights, equality, and justice for all. Importantly, we will create spaces and opportunities for residential school survivors and their descendants and their communities to continue to tell their stories in the manner they see fit, in a manner free from ongoing oppressive actions to silence this history. Ongoing dialogue is at the heart of this broad effort of truth and reconciliation. I sincerely want to thank and honor all residential school survivors. There are many here that are no longer with us. We honor their memory and their lives today. We honor all those that resisted the acts of cultural genocide inside of the residential schools and upon their departure, and celebrate their strength, their resilience, and their fortitude. We honor those that found the courage simply to take another step forward each and every day. We honor the parents, the communities, the nations that had to endure years and decades without the sounds of children's voices. We honor intergenerational survivors who are hard at work breaking the patterns of violence created by colonization and the residential school system. We honor the elders and knowledge keepers who have kept Indigenous knowledge and wisdom alive. We honor the land, our original mother. Lastly, we honor the work of the commissioners of the TRC who listened to so many survivors across Canada and had the vision and courage to create these calls to action we are now implementing. We've taken a significant step forward in our correcting a massive historical blind spot in our collective consciousness. Canada, as a nation, has officially recognized the residential schools as an event of national historical significance for all of the reasons outlined above. This is a moment we cannot turn back from. This is truly history changing. This is paving the way for future individual sites to be recognized under the full autonomy of leaderships and communities as they continue to pursue their own path of reconciliation and self-determination. There remains a long road ahead and many more calls to be implemented. We can never forget, and these designations help ensure that we never will. I would next like to welcome remarks from the leadership of the National Indigenous Peoples organizations in this country. Assembly of First Nations National Chief Perry Bellegarde, Inuit Taperet Kanatami President Natano Bed, and joining us here in the heartland of the Métis, in the Red River, Minister Andrew Carrier of the Métis National Council.
Danse. First, I want to recognize the hosts of this important ceremony, the Longclaws First Nations of Treaty 1 territory. I also want to recognize and honor all the people who worked so hard to make this happen, including the commissioners of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, all those who participated in the commission, and the leadership of the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. I also want to recognize Parks Canada for their partnership in making this designation a reality. But most of all, I lift up and honor those we lost in the system, the survivors of those schools and their families. First Nations have an inalienable right to know the truth about what happened here and why. This designation is another step towards Canada fully recognizing the human rights violations that took place not only here, but in many parts of this country. As Justice Murray Sinclair says, education is the key to reconciliation. We all must understand the lasting impacts these schools had and continue to have on our First Nations cultures, languages, and families. This is a story of terrible wrongs, but it's also a story of strength and resilience. The survivors and their families had a long and difficult struggle just to have their stories heard and their truth acknowledged. This designation recognizes that the courage and strength of residential school survivors is a defining part of Canada's history. They deserve to be heard, remembered, and honored. Survivors, this is your day, and I honor you. Canada's apology to residential school survivors stated, "There is no place in Canada for the attitudes that inspired the Indian residential school system to ever prevail again." The Truth and Reconciliation gave us a roadmap with 94 calls to action. Commemoration is one of the steps on the road, but the journey's not over. We must all continue walking this road together. Ekuse, Kananas Continua.
Hi, I'm Natan Obed, President of Inuit Taperet Kanatami. First, I'd like to thank the elders and the survivors who are participating and watching this event today. Thank you, Nakomi, for all the things that you have done to make this day possible and for your continued strength. I'd also like to recognize Ministers Bennett, Wilkinson, and Miller. Thank you for participating today and also for your remarks. I'd also like to recognize my colleagues, National Chief Perry Bellegarde and President David Chartrand, and of course, Ryan Moran, the host of this event. Thank you so much for your continued work at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. We're very pleased today to be celebrating or to be recognizing the designation of residential schools as a National Historic Event, and also to recognize individual schools as National Historic Sites. I want to thank all of those who participated in making this happen, and especially for the Inuit who have been a part of the Elders Advisory Circle of the NCTR, and especially Sarah Piogiwak, who is from Baker Lake, who sadly has passed away, but played an instrumental role in making this happen on behalf of Inuit. Inuit were devastated by the residential school process. Many Inuit died in residential schools, many Inuit were abused, and Inuit are still healing from the residential school era. I want to thank all residential school survivors and their families for their continued strength. And I want to also celebrate the fact that we are so resilient, and our culture is strong and determined to continue to fight for our own self-determination and for the betterment of our communities, our families, and of course ourselves. Recognizing residential schools in this manner will ensure that this story does not go away, and the truth of what happened at these schools is a part of Canada's history and a part of an understanding of what makes this country Canada. It's not necessarily something that any of us want to remember, but it is something that we have to remember to ensure that we do not repeat racist policies and that belittle Indigenous peoples and take away our rights. But also, it reminds us of where we've come from and the fact that we are still a nation in progress, and that we have to do all that we can to ensure that Indigenous peoples' rights and our well-being come first in the conversations around how to build a better Canada. Nakumik, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank our elder, Wambidi Wakita, for the opening prayer and starting us off of the commemoration ceremony in a good way. I also want to recognize all our elders, our seniors are there in our community. Thank you for being the knowledge keeper of our language, our culture, and our oral history. Now I have to put these on. Thank you for inviting the Métis Nation to speak at this very important event. I want to recognize our hosts, Long Plain First Nations, the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation, Parks Canada, and the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change. The President of the Métis Nation, Clément Chartier, has been a strong advocate of the rights of Métis Nation residential school survivors for decades and provided support for this designation. I had the honor of contributing to the report leading to this designation as the Minister of Residential Schools for the Manitoba Métis Federation and as a member of the Governing Council of the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation. This designation of the residential school system is an event of national significance, is an important day for the Métis Nation. Many people are not aware of the fact that the Métis Nation citizens were not part of the Indian Residential Schools Agreement. For example, it was only in 2019 from the Government of Canada entered into an agreement to compensate former Métis residential school survivors of the Longclaws residential schools in Saskatchewan. All survivors have had to walk a long and difficult road to have their truth heard and recognized. Métis Nation survivors are still on that road, and today is a positive step towards reconciliation. The designation of residential school system as an event of national historic importance is a crucial and welcome recognition of the wrong that has done to all the students, to all their families, and to all their nations. This designation will create new opportunities for those Métis Nation communities who seek to be acknowledged and teach the public about the experiences of our Métis Nation survivors. It is one of many steps in a journey towards truth and reconciliation. We will continue to fight for full redress and teach the public about the full redress for our Métis Nation citizens who attended residential schools. We welcome this development and we honor all residential survivors who have carried on the tradition of our people and overcome the harms they suffered so they could remain true to our culture, provide for their families, and create long, loving homes for their children and grandchildren. Merci, miigwech.
Thank you, Minister Carrier, National Chief Bellegarde, and President Obed for those important remarks. I next have the honor of introducing Chief of Long Plains First Nation, Dennis Meaches, who hosted an important ceremony in Long Plains just but a few short days ago. An important part of this overall designation is recognizing and affirming the individual sites of human rights violations, which are the residential school sites themselves. Chief Meaches will be bringing remarks on behalf of Long Plain First Nation, our host of today's gathering.
Miigwech, Ryan. Abaju, Debenaganatak, Zungoabeg and Udishnikas. Benasi do them. Kanush Kudiak Dunje, Aganakana, Akana Awaya. Today is a day of reflection. Today is also a difficult day for many. As we recall the phrase, to kill the Indian within the child, uttered by our first Prime Minister. And that phrase has seeped into the consciousness of the nation, generation after generation. Residential schools are probably one of the darkest chapters in our history. A difficult time for all of our people, Indigenous people right across this country. And we have worked hard at Long Plain First Nation for quite some time to work towards an Indigenous residential school museum for our people. And the work began, I do want to acknowledge former Chief Ernie Daniels, who's quite instrumental in the work that we've been doing at Long Plain First Nation, and is still quite active with the Treaty 1 Nation government. We acquired that property in 1981 as part of our treaty land entitlement. And in some ways, the dark history there, Long Plain, the Kishkimakwa Reserve. If you visit that reserve today, you'll see that the Long Plain people have changed that place into a place of darkness to a place of light. And it's also acknowledging the challenges we faced throughout the years. And a quick story, my uncle Norman Peters. They put him outside the residential school when he was just a young child on the grate, thinking that he may not survive the night. His friend snuck out to be with him. In the morning, he had recovered. And he went on to be an upstanding citizen of Long Plain and Canada. He joined the Canadian military and served as a warrior in Germany for a number of years. My mother, who ran away along with her two friends from the Portage Residential School, was caught by the Assiniboine River as it up the river. She was brought back along with her friends, and they, for punishment, they shaved their heads off. And they were very, very ashamed by this. So they put bags over their head to cover what had been done to them. They went down for supper, and then the matron came by and ripped the bags off to expose what they had done to them. So those are the type of stories, and there are many throughout this land and this country. Stories of horror, abuse, and today is a difficult day, but also bittersweet, in the sense that we're going to be able to preserve that history, the recognition that Canada has finally given, and to honor residential school survivors by declaring the Portage Residential School a National Historic Site. I do also want to thank Lorraine Daniels, who you'll hear from shortly. She's been one of the leaders working towards the Residential School Museum, and many of her staff, and throughout the years, the work that's been undertaken by Longclaws to preserve that building. It's a beautiful building, functional building, but it has a very, very dark history to it. So I welcome you in the years to come to visit, if you have had not a chance to visit Portage La Prairie and Kishkimakwa Reserve, to visit the Portage Indian Residential School. In closing, I do want to thank again Ryan for all the great work you've done, your staff. Andrew, thank you. Our leaders, Perry Bellegarde. And just to acknowledge National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. It's been a long journey for Long Plain and Indigenous people right across this land, but there is, with reconciliation efforts, this is an important milestone, obviously, very historic. And we hope that things will be better. Being 2020 that it has been, and a reflection on what we are currently going through with this pandemic, I always remind my grandchildren that their grandfather, their grandparents were 6 years old, 7 years old, 8 years old, and they walked through the Spanish flu and the Indian Residential School. And they did their best to maintain the customs and traditions and heritage of the Anishinaabe Dakota people of Long Plain. So one thing we know for sure is that no matter what Canada has tried to do with their policies, their legislation, our people have risen above that and are resilient, and we are strong, and we are gaining strength. And people should remember and never forget that history. But the future does look bright in some, when you think about it, and the only way we believe that we can have a stronger Canada is for people to understand what happened through education awareness, and to work together in strong partnerships with one another. In our regions, the province, the government of Canada, we all need to work together. And if anything, 2020 has shown just that. So with that, blessings to you all. Thank you very much for giving us this opportunity to be here, to witness a very historic event. And Long Plain, our people are very, very grateful. We have a big job to do, a torch to carry for the future generations that are yet to come. And I thank you very much for allowing us that opportunity.
It is now my distinct honor to invite Lorraine Daniels, residential school survivor and survivor of the Portage Indian Residential School, to the stage to bring remarks on behalf of all those survivors from that community.
Chimigwach Kishamanadu, As a member of the Long Plain First Nation, it is an honor to be part of this historic event where the Government of Canada is now recognizing the national historic significance of the residential school system, which validates my experience as a residential school survivor, that the system must always be remembered for its profound and damaging effects on the lives of so many people. Today, we celebrate a historic milestone for survivors. The residential school is a place where history and culture meet, a step towards truth and reconciliation process. As survivors, we have often been called upon to forgive, but as survivors, we know that no matter how much healing occurs, we can never forget. As is made clear through this commemoration ceremony, all Canadians should never forget. It is only by knowing our past that we can build a better future for our children, our families, our communities, whether we're Indigenous or non-Indigenous. We can only build a society that holds true to our values of equality, non-discrimination, fairness, transparency, if the Government of Canada accepts responsibility for its past wrongful actions and raises awareness about those wrongful actions. That is the purpose of today's announcement. This is what makes this an important day. I thank my leadership for the submission to have the former Portage la Prairie Residential School designated as a National Historic Site. I thank the Minister of Environment and Climate Change and Minister responsible for Parks Canada, Jonathan Wilkinson, for making this designation today. I invite all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Nation survivors to put forth their submissions, to have their own residential schools commemorated as part of reflecting the history and legacy of residential schools across the country. As survivors, we have demonstrated our strength and our resilience in the face of adversity, and we can, together, continue to heal and build a strong future for our children, our grandchildren, and all the future generations. And in closing, to the residential school survivors, it is my hope that those who wait upon our Creator, Gishema Nidu, that they shall renew their strength, they shall mount up with wings like eagles, they shall run and not be weary, they shall walk and not faint. Jimigwech Manidu.
Thank you so much, Lorraine, for those inspiring and powerful words on behalf of survivors. The other community officially recognized today is the community surrounding the Shubenacadie Residential School in Nova Scotia. Next, we will hear some very important reflections on that school's impact and the history that lay there, as it is being recognized as another National Historic Site in this country.
I'm a survivor of the Shubenacadie Residential School. I was 4.5. I came to join my sister and my brother. My family was one of the last children to leave the school in 1967 when it closed. It's been 53 years. Yeah. In the 80s, there was a fire. It burned like it was made of wood. The flames were hundreds of feet up above. People were from all over to watch the school burn. We are in Shubenacadie on the former site of the Shubenacadie Indian Residential School, beside the plastic factory that's here right now. I come here often to do ceremony for our ancestors, to leave food offerings for our spirits that are here, and to pray for the families that are still here, that are still struggling. and those that are still on their healing journey. The site should have been maintained as a sacred site. When you come here, you can feel the spirits here. You can feel the energy. Now, this site is recognized as a place, a historic place. It opens up the conversation to talk about truth and reconciliation. We've been working on this with the tripartite Culture and Heritage Committee, Mi'kmaq Way to Burt, Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaq, with the federal government and the provincial government and our Mi'kmaq government. I have to thank them for helping to speed up the process. But also I have to thank the survivors. Their tenacity and their courage and their patience. They're seniors, you know, they're elders. And we have lost so many. This place impacted so many lives. And I pray that this place will help us to acknowledge our past, but also to help us to heal for the future, and making sure our descendants and all Canadians will have a place to come to honor the survivors so that no one will ever forget about the legacy of the residential school in Shubenacadie.
To say a very special thank you to the survivors from Shubenacadie, and specifically Doreen Bernard, who was such an important advocate for the recognition and realization of that school becoming a National Historic Site. Someone else who has fought for the rights of survivors tirelessly now for years and years, and is a very dear friend, is Eugene Arcand, chair of our governing circle at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, a member of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's Survivors Circle, and a tireless advocate for the rights of survivors. I'd now like to play a very special message from Eugene Arcand.
Anse, nigan nas kumagutawi no muta kakiwi pito taihwa. Nas kumag winange ay sino makikse pa kaupena chig uspagan. Miasin. I thank the Creator for bringing us all together here today, and I thank all of those that raised their pipes this morning for this historic event. Today I'm honored to represent the governing circle of the National Center of Truth and Reconciliation in this historic event with our partner, Parks Canada. I want to applaud our staff at the National Center and those from Parks Canada who have worked tirelessly over the past year to 18 months on bringing us to this action today. This action, which is a call to action number 79 on the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. I applaud both groups for getting here. And I know as the National Center is proud to be able to deliver these monuments, these sites of historic significance in this country to promote public education and understanding in regards to Canada's darkest secret. I have now done my due diligence as a governing circle representative. I'm speaking now as a residential school survivor who spent 11 years of my childhood in one of these institutions. I interpret what has happened here in Call to Action number 79 as a first phase of our partnership. It's important for Parks Canada and succeeding governments to recognize that there has to be a phase 2 and possibly a phase 3. While we were away at residential school in the last 150 years, there has been simultaneous actions happening in regards to the appropriation of our lands and designations as national parks. Today, national parks in Canada have a larger landmass than all the reserves in Canada put together. And while this was happening simultaneously, we were being put through a system with genocidal practices. We were being indoctrinated. And while we were busy at that, our lands were being moved into what is now Parks Canada. So when I say the second phase, I mean this totally constructively. The second phase includes some designations on every park adjacent to the First Nations who lost those lands. And those land-based education classrooms will assist us in this partnership of retaining our customs, our ceremonies, our languages, and our gathering rights to a certain degree. And we want Parks Canada to be a part of all that education. We want the Canadian public to be a part of that education. But to simply put these historical sites as a place of historic information doesn't go far enough to achieve true reconciliation. I come to you today with a good heart, but it's a heavy heart, because I know we have so much work to do in such a short period of time. Asay na naskumpna agakyo mga pekta batamek. Mio asno mga pace spike mga kiapits mustahe katus katama aksanma hi.
I'd like to extend my particular thanks to Eugene Arcand and his vision for the future of this country. We're now rapidly approaching the conclusion of this very important announcement and commemorative event today. This step is but one of many, and I would like to pass on my sincere congratulations to the survivors of Shubenacadie and of Long Plains for reaching such an important milestone in your quest that has been going on for years and years and years. To all the survivors out there across the country, we cannot change the past, but I do sincerely hope that this day gives you yet more reassurance that you are remembered, that you are loved, and that you will never be forgotten. And that those words that you spoke so clearly to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the calls to action that you gave all of us, are continuing to be honored. As a message to all Canadians, what this event marks is that this is your history now. This is national history. These histories of the residential schools are your histories, and we can no longer ignore that any longer. So the challenge that I issue to all of you is to learn these places, learn these names. Today you've learned of two, Shubenacadie and Long Plains. There are many, many more you need to learn about, and many of them are right in your very backyard. This is your history, and you need to know it, you need to learn it, and you need to own it. We will be closing in a good way today, both with a closing honor song by grandfather Wambadi Wakita and a Métis fiddle tune, the Teardrop Waltz, played by Jason Lapine, who himself was born and raised in Portage la Prairie. As we move into this close, I'd again like to extend our most sincere appreciation and congratulations to all those survivors out there that have been fighting so hard for your histories to be known and heard. And a huge thank you and miigwech to all of you that have tuned in, and of course, the many dignitaries that spoke so powerfully, eloquently, and beautifully today in today's ceremony. Thank you.
We are still honoring the buffalo in a contemporary way. This song came from a holy place by holy people.